There are just a few cases in which Egyptian kings have been removed from the throne by assassination, that we know of. If there were more, history has successfully obscured them from our view. Why? As with most crimes, follow the money. The Egyptian kings were regarded as living gods. The system of monarchy that supported their reign included many nobles and priests who all depended on the king for their wealth. Therefore, it was in their best interest to maintain the idea of the king as a living god. It was part of the belief that kept the common people of Egypt obedient to the king for 3,000 years. If they let it be known that kings were just as vulnerable as other mortals, that would damage people's belief in their kingly divine power. Quick disclaimer, in this video, I'm only going to talk about assassinations that happened during the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom, Egypt's 3 golden ages of their ancient civilization. There were definitely more murders that occurred in the periods in between because those were periods of political fragmentation and chaos. That includes the extremely murderous Ptolemaic dynasty, which, not politically fragmented or chaotic, but definitely not part of any of the golden ages. Before the violent Ptolemies, there are only 2 examples of kings being murdered that I can think of offhand, though there are a handful of others where we suspect the king may have been murdered, but can't prove it. This video will deal with the first one. The first king in ancient Egyptian history that I learned of who was murdered was Amenemhat I. He's kind of a twofer because it's suspected that he may have killed the previous king in order to take the throne, though that is just speculation. If it was the case, that would certainly explain why someone later on might have decided that Amenemhat deserved to be murdered as well. Amenemhat I wasn't of royal blood, but he seems to have served as the vizier to the king that preceded his reign, whose name was Mentuhotep IV. This is assumed because we know that Mentuhotep IV had a vizier whose name was Amenemhat. Then the records show that the next king is also named Amenemhat, and he's not a child of Mentuhotep IV. As king, Amenemhat I would identify his own father as a nomarch named Senusret. A nomarch is basically a governor. This proves that Amenemhat I was definitely not a child of Mentuhotep IV. These clues don't necessarily prove that Amenemhat did usurp the throne. They just are there to indicate why there's speculation. It's entirely possible that Mentuhotep simply died childless and chose Amenemhat I to carry on after him. Mentuhotep IV's mummy hasn't been identified, so there's no body to examine for further evidence. Yet. Maybe someday they'll find one. Amenemhat I ruled during the Middle Kingdom. He himself kicked off a new dynasty, Egypt's 12th, beginning around 1991 BCE. Again, part of the reason Amenemhat is suspected of having murdered his predecessor is because he himself wasn't of royal birth. Being an outsider meant that he would have to work a lot harder as king to earn the respect of the nobility and the priests. One creative way he decided to do that was to build a new capital city, far away from the previous capital, which would effectively force all the nobles to follow him there if they wanted to continue to get rich off of his reign. The new city was called Ichtawi, which approximately means, in ancient Egyptian, I seize the 2 lands. In this case, the 2 lands is a reference to Upper and Lower Egypt. Oh, I'm going to get a map. Please don't judge my drawing. This is a map that I made for my classroom many, many years ago. It's been loved very much. Anyway, I just wanted to illustrate for you what I'm talking about when I say Upper and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt. This is because the Egyptians oriented their version of Egypt based on the flow of the Nile, and the Nile River flows from the south to the north. So upriver is here, and downriver is here, hence upper, lower. The ruins haven't yet been discovered, but Ichtawi was located in a place called the Fayum, which is basically that leafy shape that you could see branching off from the Nile on my map. It was far away from the original capital, Thebes, and the nobility and priesthood had to follow him in order to keep making money. It was absolutely intended to test their loyalty and to let them know that their loyalty was being tested. Before we discuss his murder, it's important to note that Amenemhat I stands out in history for another important reason. He was the first Egyptian king to make one of his sons his co-ruler. This would become a tradition for future generations of kings, and it was usually done when it was needed to prop up an insecure kingship. Amenemhat I ruled for around 30 years. Then tragedy struck. There are no official documents or records to report what exactly happened. There is only a cautionary tale and the draconian practices of his son and future descendants. A text dating to the 18th dynasty, hundreds of years later, must have been written by one of Amenemhat's successors, most likely his son Senusret I. According to Senusret, his father spoke to him in a dream after he had died, kind of like Hamlet, to tell of how he had been murdered in his bed. Here's a quotation. "As I came to, I awoke fighting, and found that it was an attack of the bodyguard. If I had quickly taken weapons in my hand, I would have made the wretches retreat with a charge. But there is none mighty in the night, none who can fight alone. No success will come without a helper. Look, my injury happened while I was without you, when the entourage had not yet heard that I would hand over to you, when I had not yet sat with you, that I might make counsels with you, for I did not plan it, I did not foresee it." Senusret I, rather than trying to hush up his father's murder, would go on to use the story to excuse severe practices during his rule and the rule of his descendants. He and his successors would continue to come up with more and more strict policies to test the loyalty of their subjects and to punish any sign of disloyalty. The attitude that comes across from Senusret I and the next couple of kings after him can perhaps be summed up by, "Look what you made me do." Yeah, it's kind of creepy. Over the next few kingships, culminating with the reign of Senusret III, the kings would put their subjects to more and more stringent loyalty tests, with draconian punishments for those who failed. You can see from Senusret III's statues that he didn't trust anyone, perhaps? His face looks very disappointed and sad and tired. His ears are huge, as if he's listening for whispers everywhere. Nobles during his reign would depict themselves with similar faces to his in their tomb paintings. However, they would not, apparently, be allowed to depict themselves with bodies as strong-looking as his. Kind of strange. Why is it that we know about the murder of Amenemhat I, but hardly ever hear of murders of any other pharaohs for most of Egypt's 3,000-year history? There's a couple of possible and most likely reasons. The number one reason, I would say, is because Amenemhat I wasn't of royal birth, and that meant that he had to think differently. He wasn't raised to think the way a prince of Egypt would normally be raised to think. He wouldn't have strategized politically the same way someone who came from an old, well-established family of royalty would think or strategize. When his sons had to deal with the fact that he had been murdered, they had to figure out a way to keep power so that they didn't lose control of the entire country and have it collapse into chaos, despite the fact that a pharaoh had just been killed. Other deaths of other pharaohs were probably dealt with behind the scenes, and since, again, Amenemhat and his family weren't of royal birth, they wouldn't necessarily know what the established traditions were for dealing with things behind the scenes. That being the case, they had to improvise some other way to handle the situation that didn't weaken them. Turning Amenemhat's murder into a tragic cautionary tale was a brilliant idea. It allowed them to position themselves as the kind of kings who would show up to right the wrongs that had been committed in the past. If you enjoyed this video, check out the next video, which will also be about one of the few known murders of a pharaoh during ancient Egypt. And make sure to check out my Patreon, where you can take in-depth history classes with me and ask me questions in person. It's a lot of fun. I hope to see you there. The first king in ancient Egyptian history that I learned of who was I was about to say who was killed by murder. Murder by Death.
Murder by Death
is a fun movie. Amenemhat was killed by murder, did you know? The first king in ancient Egyptian history that I learned of who was...
Killed by murder?
He was killed by murder, you guys.